You never know. You never know. You said, you gotta learn. It's like technology.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Amanda. I'm the events manager here at the Scholar. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed tonight's program with Jill Lepore and Representative Malcolm Kenyatta. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping notes. Number one, Representative Kenyatta is unfortunately running a little late, so we are going to get started with Jill this evening, and then he will join us as soon as he's able. Beyond that, we have recently announced the return of the 13th annual Harrisburg Book Festival. So mark your calendars. Yeah! Mark your calendars for October 15th through the 19th, when we'll be hosting authors like Nick Offerman, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and many, many more. One event I would like to plug for this crowd in particular is America at 250, The Pursuit of Liberty, with Jeffrey Rosen, CEO of the National Constitution Center, and Yale Law professor Justin Driver. That will take place right here at the bookstore on Sunday, October 19th at 4 p.m. Registration is free but required to attend this event, so visit our website, HBG Bookfest, for more information. Lastly, most of you already have a copy of We the People in your hands this evening. We do have additional copies of Jill's books available for purchase at the cafe. We will also be holding a book signing next door immediately following the talk. That will be in our Rare Books building, so you'll go out the front doors and make a left. There will most likely already be a line. As always, I thank you for your support of our authors, the bookstore, and the future of our event series. And now I do have the honor of introducing our speakers for the evening. Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, who will be here, is a third-generation North Philadelphia native and legislator. He's currently serving in the Pennsylvania General Assembly. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Public Communications and a minor in Political Science from Temple University, as well as an MS in Strategic and Digital Communications from Drexel University. He also completed the Harvard Kennedy School's Executives in State and Local Government program. Representative Kenyatta is a barrier-breaking public figure, becoming the first openly LGBTQ+ person of color and one of the youngest people elected to the Pennsylvania General Assembly in 2018. I will tell him he got an applause break later. All right. Jill Lepore is the prize-winning David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University and a Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Her classes focus on evidence, historical methods, the humanities, and American political history. She is also a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she has contributed since 2005. Her many books include the international bestseller, These Truths, A History of the United States, and she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Of course, tonight we are here to discuss Jill's new book, We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. Timothy Snide writes, "It is impossible to imagine a more instructive text on a more timely subject by a more accomplished historian." It's an honor to welcome Jill Lepore to the stage this evening, so without further ado, please join me in giving her a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I might just stand for a few minutes until Representative Kenyatta joins us. Thanks, everyone, for coming out to talk about the Constitution. I like how you guys have your own, Liberty Bell right here. I feel like someone should jump up and swing from that, and we just celebrate liberty. I've been on the road for a couple of weeks now, And I feel like every day people are sadder and sadder and sadder. So it's a little hard to have this upbeat conversation about the Constitution right this second, but I think we need to be upbeat. So, yes. I spend a lot of time on the road lately, and there's a highway underpass that I go through underneath often. And rain or shine, there are people out there with this stitched together set of sheets dangling off the overpass that says, save our democracy, uphold our Constitution. So we can have a collective like beep, beep. I started on this book a few years ago, and I had in mind that I would try to have it come out this fall for the beginning of our sesquiquincentennial season as a nation. In 2026, of course, we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. You should all come see Justin Driver in a few weeks at your book festival. But we tend to forget that 1776 also marks the 250th anniversary of American constitutionalism. Whose state's first constitution was written in 1776? Okay, good. Pennsylvania, and whose state constitution was the most radical of all of the American constitutions? Pennsylvania's. Thank you. I'm glad everyone has some sense of Pennsylvania history. So I think actually, I really wanted to kind of revisit the history of the U.S. Constitution for this occasion in order to just think about what even a constitution is, and what it's for, what state constitutions are for, why constitutions are written down, and why the U.S. Constitution is written down, and what it's for, and how they work. And I also really wanted to sort of expand our common understanding of the history of constitutionalism. I think we have, for the most part, I would say it's just generally true, like history departments in universities don't usually teach constitutional history anymore. Constitutional history, that's been the case really since the 1960s. Constitutional history is taught in law schools, which it should be, but where it is really just a series of Supreme Court decisions. And that's how law students have to understand constitutional law, like which decision is the holding that matters and how it relates to earlier decisions. And I think as a whole, we now have, outside of law schools and universities, just regular people tend to think of the Constitution as whatever the Supreme Court says it is. And that's a big part of what our Constitution is. But that's not all that our Constitution is. And certainly our constitutional history as a people and a nation is much bigger than the rulings of the Supreme Court. We also kind of have we're living this very odd moment right now where a lot of people think the Constitution is whatever the White House says the Constitution is, which is, and I think that our president thinks that's what the Constitution is, and that is not provided for, in fact, in the Constitution. That is a claim that is in defiance of our entire constitutional system with its separation of powers. So it just seems to me a good time for us to be thinking about why do we have the Constitution we have? Is it the Constitution we want? And to remind ourselves that the principle on which our Constitution rests is that we, the people in this room, these people, us, we are the authors of the Constitution. And if we have failed to do much revising of it lately, that's kind of on us. But there are also some structural things to think about historically. So I am really just trying to fill time. Someone want to, what? Thank you, okay. So I could tell you more things about the book. So I had this idea that a way to kind of think about constitutional history differently than, we do when we only think about the Supreme Court would be to look at all the times people have tried to amend the Constitution over its whole history. And so some years ago, I got a grant from the now defunct National Endowment for the Humanities, which funded a digital research project that I did with a bunch of amazing undergraduates, and we compiled this database of every attempt to amend the U.S. Constitution, there, including like 12,000 proposals introduced on the floor of Congress and 9,000 petitions submitted to Congress. And you can look at it at theamendmentsproject.org. But much of what I did in this book was really try to tell the story of the Constitution through the history of failed attempts to amend it. And now our evening is being amended and improved. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
Now, I hope you didn't have too much fun without me. We didn't even have a chance to get started. Good afternoon, good evening. Where am I at? I'm like, good evening. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be in this beautiful bookstore. Look at this. This is a jewel.
It really is stunning. I will say, Central Pennsylvania and Harrisburg in particular knows how to do bookstores, don't we? We know how to do it. And I just have to start by saying, wow. This is a big book, so it's okay if you haven't read the full thing yet. But
there will be a quiz.
At the end, you can't leave unless you pass. So pay close attention. But thank you for writing this, and I want to obviously, with some of the questions, really dig into the meat of the book. But I want to start just talking about you first. How did this project change you?
Yeah, I really struggled to be a good quantitative social scientist. This book. I really did want to think quantitatively about the scale of constitutional change and constitutional failure. That was a big challenge for me. So it changed me in the sense that I really struggled with my own instincts as a writer to tell stories about people. I love just finding weird, obscure characters and then telling the stories of their lives to embody like a large political idea. And that is always really fun for me. But I struggled a bit with like, okay, I actually think a quantitative social scientist could do something really interesting with this data, because I was just explaining about this big data project that I did. So it was another opportunity for me to realize math is not my strong suit.
And to, and I just want to start by making the First Amendment here. You call this a history of the U.S. Constitution. I think in so many ways it feels like a history of the fifth article of the Constitution and this whole idea of constitutional change. Obviously, you've written a lot about this. I want to stick with you for a second. You've written a lot about the Constitution, about our laws, but what took you down this path of really talking about constitutional change through the amendment process?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just genuinely interested as a historian. I'm really interested in absences in the historical record. Like, why do we know so much about some things and so little about other things? And I would say every major project of mine has been an attempt to just an experiment in how to address the asymmetry of the historical record. So I once wrote, my first book was about a war between New England colonists and different native nations in New England. And the colonists left all these, poems and pamphlets and newspapers and propaganda about why they waged the war. And the native peoples left very little, but some. And I wrote a book that tried to restore a balance to the historical record and allow us to see both sides. So I did the same thing for the story of a slave conspiracy, an alleged conspiracy of black men in New York who were enslaved to destroy the city in 1741. I once wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin's sister to think about the asymmetry of the historical record between Franklin and his sister. So I think I was really interested in the asymmetry of how everything we seem to know that's right up here when we think about the Constitution is the latest Supreme Court decision or a series of the major Supreme Court decisions. And I wanted to just kind of go like this and look at the rest of the terrain. And so I think it sits pretty well with most of my other work in that. I must say, I'm interested in the story of always the weak somehow, but that's probably true. I'm never going to write a presidential biography. I really don't care. Honestly. I also find that like too easy. Like somebody's papers have already been collected and printed. That's
I don't know
no
about
fun.
this administration. We're destroying a lot of papers, but
That's a good point.
We'll see what's left.
Yeah,
We'll see what's left.
yeah.
So to that point, tell us about and maybe this was a part of what I missed, so sorry if we have to repeat it. But tell us about your process of research. You know, one of the things that jumps out to me is, A, you're just a beautiful writer. And I do mean that to flatter you. And B, I love that as you talk about not just our Constitution, but many of the constitutions, that you talk about what they're actually written on in the Iroquois, and writing it on shells, and this whole process. So talk to us about your research process and going to see some of these documents, and how maybe that was illuminative as you wrote the book.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also trying to sort of shake loose the sense of, the iconographic, like calligraphic "We the People," and like you see it on like fake parchment paper or whatever, and like it's on the walls of your kid's elementary school classroom, and it's sort of inert. Like it's like, what even is that? Like it's ye olde Constitution. And I wanted to mark that. Look, that is an old document. Like someone killed and skinned a sheep to make that. Like that's a thing that we don't do right now to make a document, like to just transport people in time a little bit. But I also really wanted to have a sense that our constitutional history is really contingent. Like things could have gone differently at any point and still can. And that sense of contingency is necessary to have a sense of possibility. Like, if you feel like our entire history was inevitable, and I think some of the, like, highly ideological accounts of American history have that, like, inevitability to it. Like, people are awful, American history is a series of atrocities. Or, people are great, America is a story of prosperity and a march of freedom and progress. And, like, it's like, they're just cartoon versions, and that you're kind of trapped in either of those stories, right? Well, then what can you do? How can the future be different? Like, it's always going to be a march of progress, or it's always going to be like another atrocities on the way. Like, you have no sense that you are as Benjamin Franklin would say, that you are the author of your own life. Like that there's such a passivity around these highly ideological accounts. So I really wanted to restore the sense that, like, look, this weird thing you didn't know about happened, and it didn't really change things, but it could have, or this thing did change things and you might not have known about it. And just to be surprised, I think really helps shake loose feeling like the feeling of stuckness that is a kind of, like, when you play statues, do you know that game when you like line up and then someone's, no. You don't. You're giving me the blank.
I'm giving her the blank stare for everybody else who has the blank stare. Okay, blank stare, people. Thank you. Okay, yes. Tell us about this show. What statues?
Oh, statues is just a kid's game. You line up. It's like red light, green light, or fishy, fishy cross my ocean.
Yes.
Yeah, like the person in front, if they turn around, you have to freeze.
Okay.
I think history feels that way. Like you turn around.
That was another thing lost to history, Jill. That game did not follow in my generation.
I'm not sure it's generational. Maybe it's a New England thing.
Jill is very young and spry, but a part of what you did so well to me, to the points that you just made, is really breathe life to that contention and that tension that you mentioned, that America is somehow on autopilot, right? And depending on your perspective, that autopilot takes us down a brighter, more prosperous, more open path, or takes us down a path that is more dark and authoritarian and retrenched. And you really breathe life in it throughout this book, in a way that just felt very, very special to read. One of the things that stuck out to me when you talked about the Constitution Constitution, you said that laws govern people, the Constitution governs how the government operates. Talk a little bit more about that distinction, because that is not a way I've heard somebody talk about the Constitution before, and it's something that stuck with me. And I had the chance to ask the author what you meant.
I do a fair amount of work trying to just explain like why we even have written constitutions, because not everybody does. And it's not clear that written constitutions are going to survive, right? It's a product of a moment in time, and it's a technology, and we're in a different technological moment. So, yeah, partly just trying to explain that. Like also, I read some survey once, I don't remember the number, but some significant number of percentage of Americans don't know their states even have constitutions. Like, I just think there's like a basic, like, what is a constitution? So trying to explain, like, your legislature, you elect your Pennsylvania Assembly, or we elect members of Congress, they make laws. Pennsylvania make laws for states, and the federal government, makes laws for the country as a whole. But legislatures are not supposed to be determining fundamental law. And they also can't constrain themselves. So anything that might limit what a legislator might do, or what the legislature itself might do, there has to be a higher law than ordinary law. And in our constitutional world, that higher law is a constitution. And in many parts of the world, like England still doesn't have a written constitution. England's constitution is unwritten. That higher law, England does have a constitution. It is just an unwritten constitution. That higher law is unwritten, and it can naturally change as required. It is an understanding. It is a set of core principles and beliefs and ideals that are widely shared and known, but not written down. And the colonists hated that, because they were like, once Parliament was taxing the colonies in ways that the colonists disagreed with in the 1760s and 1770s, the colonists kept saying, well, that's unconstitutional. And Parliament was like, so you say. And so when the colonies decided to protest those taxes, and then the royal governors turned tail and ran away, and the colonies didn't have governments anymore. They were like, late 1775, early 1776. They're like, well, we need to figure out, like, do we want a governor again? Do we want a legislature? Like, how are we going to do this? And they immediately decided they were going to write down what they were going to do. Partly they were replacing their colonial charter, so they were used to something written about themselves. But also they really believed that it was a problem not to write down the Constitution. So they started, beginning in January 1776, writing down their constitutions. But they also gradually came to be committed to the idea that, well, who's going to write down the constitutions? Actually, we believe that they really were committed to Republican government. There's this whole contest in Pennsylvania in the spring of 1776, because people who were, in what had been the legislature were like, well, we'll write the Constitution. And the people are like, no, you will not. We will write the Constitution. And they decide to have a convention. And then, so that's a new invention. Like, we'll elect special people who are not going to be serving in the legislature, who are not just giving the legislature power or whatever. And then they came up with the idea, we'll also have to send it to the people to ratify it. Like, even the convention can't say. And then, because we've written it down, which is helpful, that means, unlike an unwritten constitution, we need a mechanism to change it. So Pennsylvania came up with this idea. I think it was every 7 years, every 8 years, this council would meet, a council basically to amend the Pennsylvania Constitution would meet to amend it. They did just a bunch of experiments to figure out how to amend the thing. But these sort of basic principles that the legislature can't write a constitution, that a convention must write the Constitution, that it must be ratified by the people, and it must be amendable by the people, are like these three big principal contributions of American constitutionalism, so much so that, like, in Massachusetts, the legislature was like, we're having a war right now. Like, we don't have time for a convention. We're just going to write a constitution. And they sent it to the towns, and their towns are like, yeah, no, because you wrote it and we write it. And then they had to do the whole thing all over again. So when I say, like, laws govern people, but constitutions govern governments, that's that higher step. And that's why legislatures can't amend constitutions.
That's very, very, very good. I love this. So I want to start digging more into the book, but I want you to set the scene a little bit for the Constitutional Convention that brought us the Constitution that we have now. Obviously, a lot of fits and starts in this new country, the Articles of Confederation, all these different ways that we tried to figure it out. So when we get to Philadelphia and they're writing it down, just sort of lay the scene for folks of where the country is at that point and where the mindset is of the folks who have come to now write this new constitution.
Yeah. So the states had a compact or a league, like a treaty, for the sake of the war called the Articles of Confederation. They're a little bit like the European Union, right? Like, we're independent states, but we are band together for a specific purpose, in this case, to fight the war against England. And the Articles of Confederation could be amended, but they required all 13 states to agree. And they never all agreed, because usually Rhode Island was like, yeah, no, because
Rhode Island is still like that.
Because we're like the fingernail on your pinky of the whole rest of you is the body, but we're like, yeah, no. So it was very frustrating. People like, obviously doesn't make any sense. And then in 1786, farmers in Massachusetts didn't want to pay taxes, and they couldn't pay taxes because they were in terrible debt because of all that they had lost during the Revolutionary War. And they were like, okay, in the spirit of, the American Revolution, we're going to take up arms against the government of Massachusetts. And, it was this fairly bloody, complicated conflict. And Congress wanted to send an army to Massachusetts to defeat the rebellion, but they didn't have any authority to do that. They also didn't have any authority to deal with the debt. There were 13 different currencies in the 13 different states, and Congress couldn't do anything. Like, Congress was hard to believe. Congress was more useless than it is now.
Well, this Congress is like, hold my beer, Jill.
Yeah, right.
We're on to something.
Yeah. So they had the idea, some members of Congress, like, we got to have a convention. We'll meet in Annapolis. And then things were so bad that nobody showed up. So then they were like, the guys who did show up were like, all right, we're going to do this again. We're going to do it in Philadelphia. And we're not just going to revise the Articles of Confederation. Don't tell anybody. Shh. We're going to write a whole new constitution for the country. And so they met 55 of them. Most of them were lawyers. Most of them are pretty wealthy. A lot of them were Southern slave owners. I mean, obviously a lot of them were Southerners, but the Southerners were slave owners. And what they were doing was unauthorized. They had no authority to throw away the articles. They were there to amend them. And they didn't want to be interrupted. They didn't want anyone to know what they were doing. They didn't want to be influenced. So they took a 50-year vow of secrecy. They nailed the windows shut. And I think you guys can picture a hot summer in Philadelphia with the windows nailed shut. As I often remind people, they're wearing like woolen underwear. So it was hot. The heat of it is actually kind of an important factor. But so they were trying to figure out a new frame of government. And they were mainly influenced by what the states had done. They looked at each of the state constitutions. They had a lot of political philosophy that they were leaning on. But they spent from May 10th to September 17th kind of sweating it out and arguing, and came up with a very intricate and it turned out to be extraordinarily durable system that established a sovereign federal government, but also recognized the sovereignty of the states and established the three branches of power, the three branches of the federal government, and the separation of the powers between them. And then there were a lot of things that they did that were rank compromises. that have caused endless bloodshed, argument, disputation, so ever since, the chief of which was the Southerners won. It was a new thing at the time to have a legislature proportionate to the population. That's a really democratic idea. Like, that's a huge, huge political innovation. And that's why the U.S. is the first country to require a census, because we have to count the people in order to have proportionate representation. But once they had the idea of proportionate representation, then the Southerners were like, oh, this is excellent, because, you know, we have 700,000 enslaved people, and that's going to really boost our representation in Congress. And the Northerners were like,
so they are people.
yeah, the Northerners are like, okay, well then why don't we end slavery? If you know, because you otherwise want to count them as property. So they came up with this compromise, this 3/5 compromise, which sort of everybody regretted, but really the Southerners regretted the least, because they had to give up the least. And then they came up with another compromise, because then the small states like Rhode Island were like, well, if the Southerners get all that, then we want equal suffrage in the Senate, and that's why we have 2 senators per state. That's to kind of counterweight, because everything is about, you know, you picture the scales of justice. Everything is about balancing and counterbalancing. And then those were the 2 worst compromises of the convention, and they put them both into other parts of the Constitution, one of which is the Electoral College, and the other of which is the amendment provision, because the nature of those compromises also affects whether or not how easy or difficult it is to amend the Constitution.
So to that point, and thank you, like that is beautiful, and this is what you do throughout the book that I love, to like take us into the heat of it and the woolen undergarments that people have, to really understand and get this visceral connection. But one of the things that you say is that this would not have happened without Article 5. Without the capacity for us to come back and make additional changes, understanding that what was written was beautiful in so many ways, has been enduring in so many ways, not enduring in other ways, but that there was a need to do additional changes. So talk to us about that part of the compromise, because the 3/5 compromise and the Senate compromise is one that people who know a little bit about the Constitution spend a little bit more time thinking about, but I don't know that we spend enough time thinking about the amendment process as a compromise within itself.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that as ingenious and truly brilliant as the Constitution is, really everyone who signed it had quibbles with it. And many of the 55 delegates, only 39 signed it. Some of them didn't sign it because it didn't include a Bill of Rights. George Mason of Virginia was like, dudes, I could do that. Like, it's going to take me just a few hours. Let's take care of that. And people were like, I'm going home to my wife. I don't care what you're doing. Like, I'm out of here. Like, people just would not stick around for the Bill of Rights. And a lot of the delegates thought a Bill of Rights was not only unnecessary, but dangerous. And there's a strong argument about that. But they kind of, like, Benjamin Franklin wrote this beautiful speech at the end of the convention that he was too old to deliver, but the other Pennsylvania delegate, James Wilson, stood up and delivered, and is this beautiful speech about how he's trying to convince people who are dubious about signing to sign it. And it's just like, look, I consent to this Constitution because while it is not the best, we can do no better right now, and I know that we're all infallible, and good thing we'll be able to change it, and our descendants will be able to change it. That promise that it could be changed was what even just got the thing out the door. And then when it went to the states were like, we have so many problems with this. We have so many things we want to change about it, so many things we want to add to it. Revisions, additions, corrections, and it looked like it wasn't going to be ratified. And then the Federalists who supported ratification just said their kind of slogan was ratify now, amend later. Ratify now, and they kind of just convinced the states, like, we'll take a note, we'll make a list of all the things you want us to do, and as soon as we get it ratified and we start the government and like elect a president, inaugurate a Congress, then we'll start amending. And they weren't lying. I mean, they did add 10 amendments pretty quickly, but they wouldn't have gotten there without that. And really the single best speech during the ratification debates is made by a Pennsylvanian, James Wilson. And he says, in this huge celebration in Philadelphia, July 4th, 1788, and he says, just think of it like in all of human history, there has never been a people that has decided their own frame of government, that has chosen how to govern themselves. And not only that, like in all of antiquity, like people have been ruled by tyrants and by armies and, by force, by violence. And we have set up a system that not only have we consented to it, we the people, but we can change it, we can improve it, we can amend. And that word amend has really powerful meanings then and now in the sense of moral meanings, like you make amends if I do you wrong, or I might mend my ways if I'm behaving like an ass all the time. And so Wilson says, like, this is the thing that will save this country, that in other countries, even if they came up with such a brilliant thing as we have come up with, if they didn't think of this, the only way to fundamentally change a government would be by insurrection. But we have this beautiful idea of amendment in the hands of the people, and this means that we will not constantly be living in an insurrectionary world of politics. So, part of the argument of the book is that since we can no longer amend the U.S. Constitution and haven't been able to in like a couple of generations now, we are living in an era of insurrectionary politics.
So I do want to come back to that, but can you talk a little bit more about, because you have these great charts and other things that are in the book. One of them where you show in what age we've amended the Constitution. I want to come back to that for a second. But when do you feel like in your research, culturally that changed for the American people, this idea of ratify now, amend later? I think there is a, let me just pull it up here, because you say it so beautifully, and so why change it? And it is the last little paragraph here of the book. You said no constitution can be kept forever, like a butterfly under glass, tacked down with pins. And I think we have treated the Constitution, and it has been, I think in some ways, projected out that to not change the Constitution is to love it and to have some devotion to it, and people who want to change it to suit the times are somehow less reverent to it. When I would argue the amending of the Constitution is the most historically accurate view in the way that you can revere it the most, by understanding that it is a living, breathing document that should change to fit our current reality and to fit the desires of this iteration of Americans who still, are supposed to be governed with our consent. It has not felt like that recently, that we're being governed by our consent, but I'm trying to keep this about the book and not about other things that are happening. But when do you feel like culturally that changed? Because that does feel like a big change.
Yeah, so I actually think it's not a switch that goes on and off. It's more like a bit of a strobe light. So there are long periods in American history, decades, where there's no amending going on in terms of Article 5 amendment, where the Constitution is always changing. It's always changing, and the Supreme Court is always changing it. But when the Supreme Court changes it a lot, people tend to get pissed off, and then they kind of grab back the power of amendment. And so, you go from, I think, 1803 to 1865 without an amendment. That's from the 12th to the 13th. And you don't get the 13th except there's a war, right? Then you get the 13th, 14th, 15th, right, all in succession. Then you go from 1870, which is the 15th Amendment, to 1913, which is the 16th, and then you get the 13th, 14th, then you get 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th in 7 years. They tend to be like a dam bursting. So this is where the quantitative social scientist would be better skilled than I am. But be like, what is the thing that makes the dam burst? Well, the Civil War, it's a war. right? The progressive era, it's actually, you could argue that it is how widespread progressivism is across all of the political parties. We could say now, in our era, the reason the reason the river is dammed up is polarization just makes it impossible to amend the Constitution, and also we are living in an era of particular constitutional veneration, and that really started in the 1980s. It's fairly recent. Like, in the late 1960s, I came across this, which kind of blew my mind. People remember McGeorge Bundy? 1969, McGeorge Bundy gives this big speech he's like, the whole Constitution needs to be thrown away and we need a new one. And he's like, couldn't be like a more establishment figure. Like, there's just a real sense by the end of the 1960s, and between 1961 and 1971, there were 4 constitutional amendments. So people were like, in that moment, yeah, we maybe need to start again. Like, something was unlocked then. But the cultural change that you're asking about really dates to the 1980s, and it is associated with Reagan's Justice Department, which determines that the way that Reagan conservatives are going to seize power over the Constitution, since they don't have the votes to amend it. They'd supported a right to life amendment, they'd supported a balanced budget amendment, and they weren't getting anywhere with those. So they decide to invent this thing called originalism, and then use that as a litmus test for Supreme Court nominees and say, well, anyone in the federal judiciary, if you subscribe to this theory of constitutional interpretation, you can be a judge or a justice. And that happens right at the same time as the bicentennial of the Constitution. So 1987, this time of year, 1987, September 1987 was the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, but it was also when Robert Bork was on television every day because he'd been nominated a Reagan nominee to the Supreme Court, and he was an ardent proponent of originalism. But the schism then that we see now, there used to be sort of more of a counter to that. So that year, 1987, the Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was the first black justice, he had argued Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, ending school segregation. He had been appointed by LBJ to the Supreme Court in 1967. In 1987, while the whole Bork and originalism thing is going on, everyone's parading around dressed as the Constitution, especially in Philadelphia.
It's our thing.
It's your thing. But Marshall gives this. He's asked, like, how are you going to honor the bicentennial of the Constitution? Like, it's important that we essentially imply, like, it's important that we venerate the founding fathers and the original document. And Marshall says, and honestly, I think even in his esteemed position, this was a brave thing to say. He says, I refuse that invitation. I will not honor the framing of this Constitution in 1787. It was an imperfect document from the start. I will honor the 200 years of struggle to realize its promise.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's just a kind of killer speech, and it's sort of forgotten. But I guess my point is, like, you have Bork, but then you also have Thurgood Marshall. And I feel like we now have, there's really just,
now we're in this Borkian hellhole, is what you're saying?
There's just Borkianism.
What I took from that is that all bad things can be traced back to Ronald Reagan. Sorry if you like Ronald Reagan. But we only have a few minutes left, and I could talk to you literally forever, and now you're stuck with me, bugging you. But I do want to talk about the one thing that I guess is in the news. We kind of should talk about the First Amendment. A lot of people are talking about the First Amendment now, and we had a president who said on Friday that you are not allowed to speak ill of the president, that is not acceptable under his law. So talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights, and you referenced you casually drove by it, that some folks argued that having a Bill of Rights was maybe a mistake, and you said there might be something to that. But talk to us about the First Amendment. Talk to us about the Bill of Rights. Talk to us, about that sort of American instinct to understand that we as citizens, more than anything else, we have control over what we say. And I think that throughout the different iterations of the Constitution, even as you talked about the practice of amending constitutions, I think there is this guttural American instinct of like, you are not going to tell us what to do, that we get to decide what we're going to do. And that is being challenged in a very real way right now. And I think a lot of folks are feeling listless or confused about how do we sort of reclaim that in a way that doesn't tear the country apart, but in a way that actually amends and heals, the country. Because I would argue that to take the Constitution from a sheepskin parchment to something that matters in our life, that the secret ingredient to that is all of us. Is all of us. So talk to us about the First Amendment and this long-ranging question. You nailed that question down.
Yeah, no, that's a really big question. We're not going to get to the end of it, but I think that the First Amendment, which prohibits Congress from passing a law that would impede your freedom of expression in any way, including your freedom to petition the government and your freedom of assembly, which we don't talk about as being in jeopardy, but I think really is in jeopardy as much as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And I just think we should bear that in mind. It doesn't prevent a corporation from firing someone for something that they said. In the case of, our sort of Jimmy Kimmel moment, like it does prevent the government in the form of the FCC from censoring someone, right, for prohibiting someone's expression. So the government's saying the easy way or the hard way, right? That's the problem, right? It's sort of like who's doing the suppression. But I think the bigger phenomenon that people are reacting to is the larger discussion of whether Americans can censor each other in other ways. Like it's really not a First Amendment issue. It is the so-called free speech issue, which is like a different issue than a First Amendment issue. And I think honestly, until we escape the prison of social media, we do not have freedom of expression in this country. We have a corporate-owned public discourse in which outrage is magnified. Going on 2 decades of social science research has demonstrated that being on social media is bad for our politics. It drives people to extremes. It radicalizes young people. It is terrible for people's mental health. There are 1,000 ways in which this basically infection has been set loose in the world with no restraint whatsoever. So that actually is on us, right? I think building up new forms of community and communication are on us, and that's why just being with all of you in this room is a way for us to think about how can we be together. I have been both really stirred by the conversations I've been having with people like you and in the audiences in places around the country the last couple of weeks, but also kind of terrified at the desperation that people feel, which seems to be driven by really hobbled by malice, that people feel so attacked and so scared that they're full of hate for specific people, whether it's like a Supreme Court justice or, we need to be committed to holding and expressing our views. But I've been really kind of alarmed by how willing people are to really just speak in a kind of menacing way about their fellow citizens. And I think I just feel like that comes largely from the terms of the debate that are set by algorithms and are not set by us. And so I guess I just want to maybe say one last thing about free speech. Free speech, the expression, was coined by abolitionists. And abolitionists campaigned to free speech, like free the whales, because there had been a gag rule in Congress in the 1830s that prevented anyone and banned anyone in Congress from reading out loud a petition opposing slavery. And it lasted decades. And the campaign to free speech was to lift the gag rule that said you could not even read a position opposed to slavery. The Free Soil, Free Speech Party was founded by abolitionists to make the Western
There's some
Territories
conservatives who do not want to know that
free
history.
states, but it also was founded to free speech in Congress and to make it possible in the new states to critique slavery. So I just think, like, the idea of free speech is a really radical and fundamental tradition in the United States, and the free speech tradition is different from First Amendment claims. Free speech is a political slogan that involves lifting the suppression of Americans' political views by forces of great power. In this case, in the 19th century, it was the slave power. So when the free speech movement starts in Berkeley, on the Berkeley campus in 1964, those people are actually resurrecting the free speech movement of the 19th century. Free speech then, flips in recent history to become a slogan of the right, as university progressives begin to adopt hate speech codes, and which I think were entirely misguided and also turned out to be unconstitutional. But we're now kind of stuck in this mire, like, oh, do you support free speech or are you opposed to hate speech? Like, and people don't really have any idea what they're talking about. And most of what they think they're talking about is being driven by memes on social media. So I think the kind of just like lifting the sort of silicon veil and the silicon sort of fog that we're all in is a really important first step to thinking about what do we mean by what we value and in an open society.
Very quick, what's making you feel hopeful, and how can possibly amending our Constitution help deal with what ails us now as a country?
I don't think we have any chance of amending the Constitution anytime soon. I think it is important to remember that what I call the philosophy of amendment, the idea that lies within our power to make our government better, is a really important commitment that we need to have. That is a bipartisan idea. It has nothing to do with your politics. It just has to do with, do you actually believe? Because if you don't believe that it lies within the power of the people to make the country a better country, then you don't fundamentally believe in the country as an experiment in democratic self-government. And I think I'm not indicting anybody. I think everybody believes that. But I just think you have to kind of live that belief.
Jill Lepore, everybody. We the People, a history of the U.S. Constitution. So I think there's now time for questions from the audience.
Yes.
And there's a roving mic here.
Yep. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I will ask. Due to the number of people and the nature of the event, please keep your question a question. I would really appreciate that, so as many people as possible can get their questions answered. All right, we'll start over here.
One of the things that distinguishes the United States government from England is also that our Supreme Court had no general common law powers. Everything became ultimately a constitutional question when they were going to create law. And I was just wondering if any thought had been given along the long path of history to broadening it, to make it more like a judicial court, like the House of Lords.
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court has seen many iterations in its history. I mean, for one thing, the justices used to ride circuit. We had a very different era of Supreme Court history. It's not like it's always been what it is. But yeah, there absolutely have been. There certainly were during the ratification period. A lot of people did not like how the Supreme Court was laid out in the Constitution. So a lot of the proposed amendments during the ratification era concerned the court. And it has been a kind of evergreen in the world of proposed amendments to suggest many different ways to reconfigure the court. If you go into the amendmentsproject.org, you can search by topic, and you can search for the judiciary, and you will get a chronological list that you can also display geographically on a map of every proposal to reform the court in one way or another, which would I think you'd be really interested to see the range of ideas that have been bandied about.
Over here to your left.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm wondering about a personal question. You've been asking sort of personal questions of her. What shaped your perspective as a child? I mean, what were you like at 3 and 5 and 7 that made you the person you are today, who is an explainer in the most eloquent and yet basic way of America to Americans?
No, seriously, Joe, we want to know.
Yeah, I was a goon. No, the very short and entirely accurate answer is both my parents were public school teachers.
Still over here.
You've been lauded for your writing style, and thank you very much for your scholarship. There's been talk about a constitutional convention, and I guess what they say, they've got 25 or 30 states that have moved towards that. I think you sort of answered the question, but what are the chances of that coming off, and do you think that would be a good thing to have?
So there have been sporadic attempts to have a federal constitutional convention really since 1954, they've all been from the right. That's not been the case over American history as a whole, but since Brown v. Board of Education, like the first proposals after that were to have a convention to overturn Brown v. Board of Education. The movement really grew in the 50s and 60s, so that by the late 60s, I think they were within 2 or 3 states of holding a convention to overturn the one person, one vote Supreme Court decisions. So there've always been sort of kind of Southern segregationist animated efforts. The current campaign to hold a constitutional convention dates to the late 1970s and kind of Jack Kemp supply side economics, fiscal conservatives hoping to get a balanced budget amendment through and then over time, the idea got a little bit more radical, essentially to dismantle the federal government. So at this point, I think the one answer would be, why bother with a convention? They're doing it without one. I just think there's nothing is going to happen because the agenda of the people who have been behind that movement, which most recently, sort of like Greg Abbott of Texas, kind of Tea Party people, Tea Party adjacent folks, the things that they want to do are being done anyway. So I don't think the purpose of holding convention kind of matters anymore to them. I think, and I don't think we should be having a constitution. It's not up to me, but I don't think, not should or shouldn't, but I think it would not go well. I think we might agree about that. In that. Conventions used to be held all the time. The states used to always be having, I don't know when Pennsylvania's last constitutional convention was, 60s? Yeah, but so they really fell apart after the redistricting conventions. Those are redistricting because of the one man, one vote rules. Rhode Island was the last state, it's a weird state, to have.
Rhode Island again.
They called it Rogue Island in the 18th century. Rhode Island was the last U.S. state to hold a full constitutional convention in 1986. We've stopped doing it. So we're not in any position to just go from not doing it to having a federal constitutional convention. Like the civic institutions, the infrastructure that allows people, to develop the skills to do the kind of deliberating that is required. It would be as if we decided in 1970 to no longer have jury trials, and someone today was like, let's start deciding whether people are guilty or innocent based on random 12 people. We would never do that because we don't trust one another anymore. That's the same reason we would not. Whereas I think we should, I really believe in jury trials, but we are not in a place to have a constitutional convention when we generally can't gather in politically mixed environments peaceably anymore.
Okay, we are to your right.
Hi, Jill. Thanks for your time. So my question is surrounded around Federalist Paper number 10, where Madison essentially says, be very mindful of the power rolling out here because elder statesmen will not always be at that. So I think that's it has like a forward-thinking thought behind it, but it's also very short-sighted because they were creating wars with the future first president in the room during the Constitutional Convention. I'm just kind of curious of your thought about the power of that statement and kind of how it portrays into today's political climate.
Yeah, so for people who haven't been in high school history class lately, Federalist 10, which was written by James Madison, the Federalist Papers are 85 essays written by Madison, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton from New York, and John Jay. And I always say Madison wrote the most, but Hamilton wrote the best. Or maybe I say the other thing, but I can't remember right now. No, but Madison's papers are Madison's number 10 is the most famous of them, and they're rightly consulted because, especially Jay's were not that great, but Madison and Hamilton's papers really did lay out the basic political philosophy that lay behind each piece of the Constitution and explained it. Because they were trying to convince people to vote for it. What they didn't do, they didn't often really confess what they thought might go wrong, because they were trying to convince people to ratify it, and it was a very close call. They're mainly trying to convince New York to ratify. The Federalist Papers are really only printed in New York. I mean, to some degree, a couple printed elsewhere. So, but they do sort of lay out possible problems that they know readers would think of. And they know, for instance, that readers are going to be pretty suspicious of even having a president. Like, I think Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution, there isn't even a governor. Like, people are pretty opposed. Like, when they said they didn't want a king, they didn't want a king. So the reassurance that has to be given, even just about the office of an executive, has to be, well, look, the Electoral College makes sure it's not going to be just anybody. Like, that we're going to kind of sift through the popular will and choose the right person. And to be fair, at a time when it had been proposed at the Constitutional Convention, maybe we should just let the people elect the president. And everyone was like, well, that's crazy. This was James Wilson of Pennsylvania who proposed it. But people were like, that would be crazy because it's a big country and nobody knows anybody except like the people in their own town. So the other idea was to have Congress elect the president, because members of Congress would pretty much just choose one of themselves, but those would be the eminent leaders, the men of consequence in the different states. But then that was a violation of the separation of powers. So they come up with this Electoral College as a way to both like allow for a role for ordinary voters, but also to make sure it's not going to be somebody that no one's ever heard of. So it was just to say, like, there's a lot of going into the Federalist Papers and like finding the thing that supports your view. Like, you can find a thing, you can find something that's kind of on either side of most issues if you look not just at the Federalist Papers but at the private writings of these guys as well. But yeah, a chief danger that they were concerned about was the possibility of a demagogue, also someone who was really just a puppet for a foreign country, also someone who was
like seeking
the office for personal profit. They had some worries.
He sold his peanut farm, okay? He got rid of it.
Are there any pending amendments that are going through state ratification? I understand that there's one hanging in reference to women's rights. Could you talk on that?
I can explain that. So the Equal Rights Amendment, which just says Congress can't make a law that discriminates, on the basis of sex, was first introduced into Congress in 1923, 3 years after the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. And it was then endorsed by, I think, both parties in the 1940s, which is right around when countries around the world started putting equal rights provisions in their national constitutions. But it doesn't get passed through Congress until 1972. And then, which is when the women's liberation, kind of the Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug moment of, Shirley Chisholm runs for president that year. And it is expected to be very quickly ratified. And there was every reason to expect that 4 amendments had just been ratified between 1961 and 1971. It was a moment when water was rushing over the dam. And there was huge public support for the ERA. But then at the last minute in the Congress, an expiration date is tacked on to the amendment that you only have 7 years to ratify it. And nobody who supported it thought that would be a problem, because everybody it seemed like such an obvious, just add on to the civil rights movement. Anyway, but conservatives decided to oppose it in the states, and they were led by Phyllis Schlafly, who founded this organization called Stop ERA. She was a political genius, and she really organized an incredible ground game in the states. So supporters, it didn't get ratified within 7 years. Supporters managed to get 3 more years added to the deadline so that it would expire in 1982, and they did not succeed. And the Stop ERA movement was so successful that some of the states that immediately had ratified it in 72, 73, later rescinded their ratifications. So why is it bandied? Why do people talk about it now? Every time I say anything about the ERA, a bunch of people write me hate mail and say, "You're wrong, you're an idiot, you're just such an idiot, how could you say anything in public? You don't know anything, the ERA is ratified." And it was like, delete. The mail you get from people is pretty upsetting. On all sides, people say the craziest things, and that's widely, a deeply held view. But the people who believe the ERA is ratified, and Joe Biden is among them, he said, one of the last things he said leaving office, he said the ERA is ratified. The president has no role whatsoever in the ratification of an amendment, but he said it to throw his political support behind legal scholars who had been making 2 claims. One, that putting an expiration date on an amendment is unconstitutional. It's just not provided for. And 2, that rescinding a ratification is also illegal. And those are really interesting legal arguments, and I think ultimately the weight of time will be proven to be right. And if that's true, because other states have since ratified, if that's true, then in fact the ERA does have enough ratified states. And so people are just the archivist of the United States should just say, because that does have to happen, that it is in the Constitution. Well, among other things, the president, of course...
Marco Rubio is busy.
No. Of course, the president has fired the archivist of the United States and the Librarian of Congress.
Yeah, Rubio right now.
So, well, he's not going to do it. And I would say, nor should he. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked about this, and she had been very involved in the ERA and in other approaches to an equal rights regime for women. And she just said, look, you'd have to start all over again. You can't... bureaucratically say it's a paperwork issue and now this is in the Constitution, because it needs to have the spirit of the people behind it. And I adamantly believe we need an equal rights amendment. I think its failure is a sizable reason for our contemporary political misery, that an essential settlement, a constitutional settlement, basic dignity for women has not been honored in this country. I am embarrassed by it. I am unpersuaded by the argument that we have a so-called de facto ERA because there's so much law that grants equality to women. It is a very different thing to have a law or a set of laws than to have a constitutional amendment. It's the only thing that can't be overturned. So I strenuously support the supporters of the ERA. I just really think it is a very bad idea to simply declare it done.
Right, we have one more question. We're up the stairs here.
In a recent interview you did with Kara Swisher, you briefly mentioned the idea that originalism is almost a uniquely American phenomenon that might have its origins in Christian fundamentalism and literal interpretations of Scripture. I was wondering if you could expound upon that, because I found that to be a fascinating comment that you made, but there wasn't a whole lot of time to get into it then.
Yeah, no, I am really interested in that myself. I was very influenced some years ago, and I can't remember the name of the article, but the Columbia legal scholar Jamal Green wrote a really interesting article in which he said, just people are observing all the time that other countries have written constitutions, but they don't practice originalism. The states have written constitutions, but our state courts don't practice originalism. Originalism is not native to constitutionalism. It's a particular form of judicial philosophy that emerged in the United States with the rise of the modern conservative movement. So why doesn't it exist in other countries? What is different about our country that it exists here? And Green had this kind of cool empirical idea. He was like, well, if I were a scientist, I would want to have an experiment with like some control group, like a control group. So he was like, I'm going to look at every former British colony that has a written constitution and see what's different. And none of them have originalism, and see what's different about their just world of rule and law and order than from the United States. So he looked at Canada and Australia, for instance, and what he came up with, what's distinctive in the United States is the percentage of the population that are evangelical Protestants and have a very devout, particular form of exegesis, a particular way of reading Scripture, that is, deeply held and crucially important to the faith of people that live their lives that way. But it happens to be the very same way that originalists talk about how to read the Constitution, as a kind of scripture, with the kind of, so What Would Jesus Do is this famous fundamentalist book from the 1890s, and the constitutional conservatives in this country really dates to that moment when constitutional conservatives kept saying, like, well, what would the framers do? And they decided to call them founding fathers, and some of our ideas kind of, constitutional conservative tends to rise and fall with religious revivals. So originalism really tracks very well with the rise of the Christian right, the moral majority in '79, Jerry Falwell, and they just map onto one another really well. And so it makes very legible to a large portion of the population. It seems very obvious. Well, of course we should read the Constitution that way. To other people, it looks bananas.
What a great way to end, because things do feel bananas. Jill Lepore, We the People, thank you all so much for coming. And please keep clapping for the incredible staff here at Midtown. Thank you for everything you do. And clap for yourself for being here and engaging in your government. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, we are going to do a book signing next door at the Rare Books building. So you'll go out the doors, turn left, and go up the ramp. Just hold tight there. We will let you in as soon as our authors are situated. Thank you so much for coming, everybody, and have a great night.
Anything else? Do you want your water?
No, here it is. No.